The study group that I helped build from scratch kicked me out 3 days before our organic chemistry finals, claiming I was dragging them down with my questions. For 2 years, I had been the one organizing our sessions, creating study guides, and explaining complex concepts to everyone else. But when Rowan Collins started dating the professor's teaching assistant and convinced the others they didn't need me anymore, they all turned their backs on me without hesitation. They thought they had found their shortcut to success through insider information and connections. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly working as a grading assistant for Professor Hamilton, and I had access to something they desperately needed: the actual exam construction process and grading rubric. So when they excluded me, thinking I was the weak link holding them back, I decided to show them what real academic strategy looked like. I curved that exam in a way that rewarded genuine understanding over memorized hints, and watched as my former friends discovered that shortcuts don't work when someone who actually earned their position is setting the standards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Louis just aced another practice test. That guy's been carrying our whole study group since freshman year. I overheard June Bell whisper to Flora Jenkins as they packed up their notebooks after our Thursday evening session. I kept my eyes focused on cleaning the whiteboard where I'd just spent 3 hours breaking down molecular orbital theory for the group. The familiar scent of dry erase markers and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights in Thornton Hall's study room 314 had become as comfortable to me as my own dorm room. Every week, the same routine. I'd arrive 30 minutes early to reserve our spot, arrange the chairs in a circle, and set out the materials I'd prepared the night before. Yeah, without Louis, we'd all be screwed for Professor Hamilton's class, Flora replied, not bothering to lower her voice as she stuffed her organic chemistry textbook into her backpack. Remember when he stayed up all night making those reaction mechanism flowcharts for everyone before our midterm? I smiled slightly at the memory. That had been a brutal week in October when everyone was panicking about the stereochemistry unit. I'd created color-coded diagrams showing every possible reaction pathway, complete with electron movement arrows and transition state structures. Seeing everyone's relief when they finally understood the concepts had made those sleepless nights worth it. Our study group, which we jokingly dubbed the benzene ring after our 6-member composition, had humble beginnings. It started freshman year when my roommate Rowan Collins and I were both struggling through introductory chemistry in Professor Davidson's lecture hall that seated 400 students. We'd been randomly assigned as roommates in Millbrook Dormitory, and despite our different backgrounds, me from a small farming town in Wisconsin, him from an affluent suburb of Chicago, we'd bonded over our shared pre-med ambitions and mutual confusion about electron configurations. You know what? Rowan had said one particularly frustrating evening after we'd both bombed a quiz on molecular geometry. Maybe we should find some other people who are just as lost as we are and figure this out together. That's how we'd met. June Bell, a soft-spoken biology major from Oregon who sat 2 rows ahead of us and always seemed to be frantically scribbling notes. Flora Jenkins joined us next, a chemistry major with an infectious laugh who'd overheard us discussing study times in the campus dining hall. Ivy Foster, a pre-pharmacy student with an incredible work ethic, was recruited during our sophomore year when she'd helped us understand thermodynamics. Finally, Milo Costa rounded out our group junior year, a quiet, methodical student who brought a different perspective to problem-solving. By our junior year, we'd developed a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 6 p.m. sharp, study room 314 in Thornton Hall, I'd become the unofficial coordinator. Not through any formal election, but because I genuinely enjoyed the organizational aspects. I created our shared Google Drive folder, maintained our study schedule, and sent reminder texts about upcoming exams. When someone missed Professor Hamilton's notoriously fast-paced lectures, I made sure they got copies of my detailed notes. When exam season approached, I coordinated review sessions that could stretch past midnight. Louis, you're seriously saving my GPA. Ivy had told me just last month after I'd helped her finally grasp the concept of chirality. I was ready to change my major before joining this group. Those words had meant everything to me growing up. On my family's dairy farm, I'd learned the value of hard work and helping others succeed. My parents had worked double shifts to afford my tuition at Brookhaven University, and I was determined to make their sacrifice worthwhile. But more than that, I discovered that I genuinely loved teaching. Breaking down complex concepts into understandable pieces, finding new analogies to explain difficult theories. Seeing that moment of clarity in someone's eyes, it filled me with a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. Professor Hamilton's organic chemistry course was notorious across campus. Pre-med students called it the Great Filter, the class that separated those who would make it to medical school from those who would need to find alternative career paths. Hamilton himself was a brilliant researcher who'd published extensively on synthetic organic chemistry, but his teaching style was notoriously challenging. He moved through material at breakneck speed, rarely repeated explanations, and his exams were legendary for their difficulty. Hamilton doesn't curve grades was the warning passed down from upperclassmen to each new cohort of pre-med hopefuls. He believes medical schools want to see how you perform under pressure. If you can't handle organic chemistry, you can't handle the MCAT. The statistics supported the reputation. Historically, only about 30% of students earned A's or B's in Hamilton's class. The rest received C's or lower, often forcing them to retake the course or reconsider their medical school ambitions entirely. This context made our group's success even more remarkable. Through collaborative effort and consistent study habits, all 6 of us had maintained B+ averages or higher through our first 2 semesters with Hamilton. You know what I love about our group? Juned said during one of our marathon review sessions before finals last semester. We actually help each other succeed instead of competing against each other, like some of those other pre-med students. She was right. While other students guarded their notes jealously and refused to share study strategies. Our group operated on the principle that everyone's success lifted the entire team. If Milo discovered a particularly effective way to memorize functional group reactions, he shared it immediately. When Flora found a helpful online resource for understanding NMR spectroscopy, she sent the link to our group chat within minutes. I'd fostered this collaborative atmosphere, deliberately remembering my own struggles as a first-year student. There had been nights when I'd considered giving up on my pre-med dreams. Overwhelmed by the competition and complexity of the coursework, having a support system had made all the difference, and I was determined to provide that same foundation. For others, same time Thursday, Rowan asked as we gathered our belongings, the last ones to leave the study room as usual. Always, I replied, performing our traditional fist bump. I'll have the synthesis problems worked out by then. As I walked back to my apartment, I moved off campus junior year to save money. I felt that familiar sense of satisfaction that came from a productive study session. We were hitting our stride at the perfect time, with only 1 semester left before we'd all take the MCAT and apply to medical schools. Our group felt stronger and more cohesive than ever. The spring semester would bring Professor Hamilton's most challenging course, Advanced Organic Chemistry, with an emphasis on total synthesis and pharmaceutical applications. It was the capstone class that would essentially determine our readiness for medical school. But I felt confident. We'd weathered Hamilton's storms before, and we'd do it again together. I had no idea that the foundation I'd so carefully built was already showing cracks, and that the unity I'd worked so hard to maintain was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals come not from enemies, but from the people you've trusted most completely. The disruption arrived on a cold February morning in the form of Elara Finch, Professor Hamilton's new graduate teaching assistant. She walked into our advanced organic chemistry lab, wearing a crisp white coat and an air of quiet confidence that immediately commanded attention from every student in the room. Good morning, everyone. I'm Elara Finch, and I'll be your TA for the remainder of the semester, she announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from genuine expertise. I completed my undergraduate degree here at Brookhaven, with highest honors in chemistry, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in synthetic organic chemistry under Professor Hamilton's supervision. She was striking in an understated waist-shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a manner of speaking that suggested she was accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. More importantly, she clearly had Professor Hamilton's complete trust. During the lab introduction, I watched her explain complex procedures with the kind of detailed understanding that only comes from years of working closely with the professor. Unlike your previous TA, Ms. Finch has been working with me for 3 years, Professor Hamilton explained to the class. She's contributed to 2 of my recent publications and has an intimate understanding of how I structure this course. I encourage you to take advantage of her office hours. I noticed several students, including Rowan, perk up at this information. Having access to someone who truly understood Hamilton's teaching methods and testing strategies could be invaluable. In a course where the difference between an A and a B could determine medical school acceptance, any legitimate advantage was worth pursuing. After the lab session, I watched Rowan approach Elara's desk while she was organizing her materials. Even from across the room, I could see his trademark charm in action, the easy smile, the casual lean against the lab bench, the way he managed to make their conversation look effortless and natural. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So how does it feel to be working with the legendary Professor Hamilton? I heard him ask. His tone perfectly calibrated between respectful curiosity and friendly interest. Elara looked up from her paperwork. I caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in her expression. Challenging and rewarding. She replied diplomatically. He has very high standards, but his research is groundbreaking. I imagine you've picked up a lot of insights about how he approaches teaching and testing, Rowan continued, somehow making the statement sound like casual conversation rather than fishing for information. 3 years of grading his exams will certainly give you perspective on what he values in student responses, she admitted with a slight smile. I finished packing up my lab equipment and headed toward the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed something significant. Rowan had always been socially gifted. It was one of the qualities that made him such an effective study group member. He could talk to anyone, from professors to janitors, and somehow make them feel like they were the most interesting person he'd encountered all day. But there had been something different about his interaction with Elara, focused intensity that I'd rarely seen from him. 2 weeks later, that intensity had evolved into something much more substantial. Rowan started staying after every lab session to ask Elara questions about the material, their conversations stretching longer each week. What began as academic consultation gradually shifted into something more personal. Elara was telling me about her undergraduate research project Rowan mentioned casually during one of our Tuesday study sessions. She actually worked on developing a new synthetic pathway for anti-inflammatory compounds. Pretty impressive stuff. That does sound interesting, I replied. Though I noticed that Flora and June were hanging on his every word in a way that felt different from their usual attention to study group discussions. Yeah, she's incredibly smart. And she mentioned that Professor Hamilton's research group is always looking for talented undergraduates to join for summer research positions. Could be a great way to strengthen medical school applications. March, their relationship had clearly moved beyond the academic realm. I spotted them having coffee together at Grindstone Cafe, the popular study spot near the chemistry building. Their body language told a story that had nothing to do with organic chemistry leaning close together. Her hand briefly touching his arm while she laughed at something he'd said. The kind of comfortable intimacy that develops between people who've been spending significant time together. Looks like Rowan's got himself a girlfriend, Milo observed when he saw them walking across the quad together one afternoon, her arm linked through his. Good for him, June said with a grin. She seems really nice. And smart. I agreed, and I genuinely was happy for Rowan. He'd been single for most of college, focusing on his studies and our group activities. If he'd found someone who shared his academic interests and could relate to the pressures of pre-med life, that seemed like a positive development. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly their relationship would begin influencing our study group dynamics. By early April, Rowan's contributions to our sessions started carrying a different weight. Instead of sharing insights he'd developed through his own studying, he began offering information that clearly came from his conversations with. Elara Hamilton really focuses on mechanism problems for his final exams, he mentioned during one Thursday session. Elara says he particularly likes questions that require you to predict products based on reaction conditions rather than just memorizing standard transformations. How does she know that? I asked, curious about the source of such specific information. She's been grading his exams for 3 years, Rohan replied with a slight shrug, seeing the patterns in how he constructs questions. The information was undeniably valuable, and I could see the immediate impact on our group members. Instead of spending time reviewing all possible topics equally, they began focusing their energy specifically on mechanism problems and reaction prediction. Their study habits, which I'd helped them develop over 2 years of working together, suddenly shifted toward targeting the exact areas Rowan suggested. This is amazing, Flora said after Rowan shared another insight about Hamilton's preference. For multi-step synthesis problems, it's like having a roadmap for the final exam. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, I was genuinely happy that our group members felt more confident about the upcoming final. Their stress levels had noticeably decreased since Rowan started sharing Elara's insights, and everyone seemed more focused and motivated. But on the other hand, something felt fundamentally different about our dynamic. For 2 years, our study group had operated on the principle of collaborative discovery. We worked through problems together, developed understanding through discussion and mutual teaching, and built confidence through shared struggle and success. Now, increasingly, our sessions felt like information distribution meetings, where Rowan shared privileged insights, and the rest of us adjusted our study strategies accordingly. Should we maybe verify some of this information with our own analysis of past exams? I suggested during one session. Elara's insights are clearly valuable, but it might be good to supplement them with our own research. Why would we need to do that? June asked, looking genuinely puzzled. Elara literally grades these exams. She knows exactly what Hamilton is looking for. I just think it's good practice to develop our own analytical skills rather than relying too heavily on insider information, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. Lewis, you're overthinking this, Rowan said with a laugh. Elara's not giving us the answers or anything unethical. She's just helping us understand how to study more effectively. Isn't that exactly what TAs are supposed to do? He had a point. And I recognized that my concerns might be colored by a sense of displacement. For 2 years, I'd been the primary source of study strategies and academic guidance for our group. Seeing that role shift to Rowan, even indirectly through his relationship with Elara, was admittedly difficult to accept gracefully. But beyond my personal feelings, I sensed something changing in the fundamental character of our group. The collaborative spirit that had defined us was being replaced by a growing dependence on privileged information. Instead of developing deep understanding through collective effort, we were increasingly focused on gaming the system through insider knowledge. I told myself I was being overly cautious, perhaps even jealous of Rowan's new relationship and the advantages it brought to our group. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, and that the foundation we'd built together was becoming something I no longer recognized. Hey, can we talk for a minute? I asked Rowan as our study group began packing up after our Thursday session in late April. The final exam was just 3 weeks away, and the intensity in our study room had been building steadily. Sure, what's up? He replied, slinging his backpack over his shoulder as the others filed out of Thornton Hall's study room 314. June waved goodbye, clutching the latest set of exam hints that Rowan had shared during our session's specific details. About Hamilton's grading rubric that supposedly came directly from Elara's experience as his TA. I waited until we were alone, trying to organize my thoughts carefully. Over the past month, I'd watched our group dynamic transform in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The collaborative learning environment we'd built together was being replaced by something that felt more like information dependency. With everyone hanging on Rowan's every word about what Elara had revealed about Hamilton's testing methods, I've been thinking about all the insider information we've been getting through Elara. I began, choosing my words cautiously. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful that she's willing to share her insights. but I'm starting to worry that we might be crossing some ethical boundaries. Rowan's expression shifted slightly, a flash of defensiveness replacing his usual easygoing demeanor. What do you mean? Lara's not doing anything wrong. She's helping students is literally her job. I know, and I'm not questioning her. Motives? I replied quickly. It's just that some of the information feels pretty specific. Like when she told you exactly how Hamilton weights different types of problems. Or when she mentioned which chapters he never tests comprehensively. That goes beyond general study advice. Louis, Rowan said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're overthinking this, man. Every TA shares insights about their professor's testing style. Remember how much help we got from Davidson's TA freshman year when she told us to focus on acid-base equilibrium problems? He had a point, but something felt fundamentally different about this situation. Maybe you're right, but I keep thinking about what would happen if other students found out about the level of detail Elara's sharing with us. Would they consider it fair? Would Hamilton? Are you seriously suggesting that I should tell my girlfriend to stop helping my friend succeed? Rowan's tone had grown colder, and I realized I'd touched a nerve. Because that's essentially what you're asking me to do. That's not what I meant, I said, though I could hear how my concerns might sound like an attack on his relationship. I'm just wondering if we should maybe supplement Elara's insights with our own analysis, you know? Develop our understanding independently, while also benefiting from her guidance. We've been doing fine with her help, Rowan replied firmly. Everyone's confidence is up. Their practice test scores are improving, and they're actually enjoying studying for once instead of stressing about Hamilton's impossible standards. Why would we want to change a system that's working? I looked around the empty study room where we'd spent countless hours together over the past 2 years. The whiteboards still showed traces of the molecular structures I'd drawn during our session, and our usual circle of chairs remained arranged exactly as we'd left them. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted in ways I was struggling to articulate. I guess I'm worried that we're becoming too dependent on shortcuts, I said finally. What happens on the MC8 when we don't have insider information? What happens in medical school when we need to develop genuine understanding rather than gaming someone's testing patterns? Medical school is years away, Louis. Right now, we need to focus on surviving Hamilton's final exam. And if Elara's insights help us do that, I don't see the problem. The conversation ended there, but over the following week, I noticed subtle changes in how our group members interacted with me. My suggestions for additional practice problems were met with polite disinterest. When I offered to create supplementary study materials like I'd done countless times before, Flora gently declined, saying they were already feeling prepared thanks to Rowan's guidance. Most significantly, I realized that my role as the group's primary academic resource had been quietly displaced. Questions that once would have been directed to me were now posed to Rowan, with the expectation that he would consult Elara for authoritative answers. The collaborative problem-solving sessions that had been the heart of our study group were replaced by more passive information consumption. Did Elara mention anything about stereochemistry problems? June would ask, rather than working through stereochemistry concepts with the group. What did she say about synthesis pathway questions? Ivy would inquire, instead of practicing synthesis problems until we'd mastered the underlying logic. During our Tuesday session that week, I attempted to steer the conversation back toward collaborative learning. Instead of just talking about what types of problems Hamilton likes, why don't we work through some challenging examples together? I found some interesting multi-step synthesis problems that might help us develop deeper understanding. That sounds like a lot of extra work, Milo said with a slight frown. Rowan already told us that Hamilton focuses primarily on single-step mechanisms for the final. Maybe we should concentrate our energy there. But what if Rowan's information is incomplete? I asked. What if Hamilton decides to include some curveball questions that don't fit the usual pattern? Elara would know if he was planning anything unusual, Flora replied confidently. She's been working with him for 3 years. She knows exactly how he thinks. I felt a growing sense of isolation that was both professional and personal. Professionally, I was watching my study group abandon the rigorous, collaborative approach that had served us well for 2 years in favor of a shortcut mentality that made me deeply uncomfortable. But on a personal level, I was also grappling With the reality that my closest friends seemed increasingly uninterested in my contributions to our shared academic success, the situation came to a head during our Thursday session, exactly 2 weeks before Hamilton's final exam. I'd spent the previous evening creating a comprehensive review packet that synthesized all the major concepts we'd covered throughout the semester, complete with practice problems and detailed explanations. It was the kind of resource I'd always provided before major exams and something that had historically been met with gratitude and enthusiasm. I put together a review packet for everyone, I announced, distributing the 20-page document I'd carefully organized and printed. It covers all the major reaction types, includes practice problems for each chapter, and has some challenging synthesis examples that should help us prepare for anything Hamilton might throw at us. The response was polite, but notably lukewarm. Everyone accepted the packet and thanked me, but I could see them exchanging glances that suggested they considered it unnecessary, given their access to Elara's insider knowledge. "This looks really thorough, Louis," June said diplomatically, "though I'm not sure we'll have time to work through all of this. Rowan's been sharing Elara's study timeline. She thinks we should focus primarily on mechanism problems and stereochemistry. Applications, right? And she mentioned that Hamilton typically doesn't include synthesis problems that require more than 3 steps," Flora added. "So some of these more complex examples might not be the best use of our study time." I looked around the room at these people I'd considered my closest friends and academic partners for 2 years. They were politely dismissing work I'd spent hours preparing, essentially telling me that my contributions were no longer needed, because they had access to better information through Rowan's relationship with Elara. "You know what?" I said quietly, closing my own copy of the review packet. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I have been overthinking things." But even as I spoke those words, I made a decision that would ultimately determine the fate of our group and the outcome of Hamilton's final exam. If my friends believed that shortcuts and insider information were more valuable than the rigorous preparation methods we developed together, perhaps it was time for them to learn exactly what those shortcuts were worth when they were truly tested. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to ask about, was that while they were increasingly relying on second-hand information from Elara, I had been quietly developing my own insider access to Professor Hamilton's course. For the past semester, I'd been working as a grading assistant for the chemistry department, helping to evaluate exams and assignments for introductory courses. More importantly, just 2 weeks earlier, Professor Hamilton had approached me about serving as his primary grading assistant for the advanced organic chemistry final exam. He'd been impressed by my work ethic and my detailed understanding of organic chemistry concepts. He needed someone he could trust to help implement a new grading approach he'd been developing. While my former friends prepared for Hamilton's exam based on outdated information and assumptions about his testing patterns, I was about to gain access to something far more valuable: the actual exam questions and the grading rubric that would determine everyone's final grades. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd excluded me from their new information network because they believed I was holding them back with my insistence on thorough preparation. What they didn't realize was that their inside information was about to become completely worthless. The person they'd dismissed as overly cautious was positioned to influence their academic fate in ways they couldn't imagine. The transformation of our study group accelerated dramatically as we entered the final 10 days before Hamilton's exam. What had started as casual sharing of Elara's insights evolved into something that felt increasingly like systematic insider trading in academic information. "Elara showed me Hamilton's old grade books from previous semesters," Rowan announced. During our Tuesday session, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who believed he'd discovered buried treasure. "She wanted me to understand exactly how he distributes grades and what percentage of students typically get each letter grade. I looked up from the practice problems I'd been working through, feeling a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "She showed you his grade books? Isn't that confidential information?" "She's his TA, Louis," Rowan replied with barely concealed impatience. "She has access to all of that data. And anyway, she was just helping me understand the grading curve so we could strategize our preparation more effectively." "What did she find out?" June asked eagerly, her own practice problems abandoned in favor of this new intelligence. "Hamilton typically gives A's to the top 15%, B's to the next 25%, and everyone else gets C's or lower, Rowan explained, consulting notes he'd written in his phone. But here's the key insight. Students who focus on the specific types of problems he emphasizes consistently perform in the top tier, while students who try to master everything equally usually end up in the middle ranges. So we just need to make sure we're targeting the right problem types, Flora concluded, as if academic success were simply a matter of decoding the right algorithm. Exactly. And Elara identified the exact weighting Hamilton uses. Mechanism problems are 40% of the exam, stereochemistry applications are 30%, and synthesis problems are only 20%. With 10% for nomenclature and basic concepts, I watched my study group members frantically scribbling down these percentages, their faces showing the kind of relief that comes from believing you found a shortcut through an impossible challenge. But something about this entire situation felt fundamentally wrong to me, beyond just the ethical concerns I'd already raised. Rowan, how does Elara know these specific weightings? I asked. Has Hamilton shared his test construction methods with her? She's been his TA for 3 years, Louis. She's graded hundreds of his exams. She can analyze the patterns. But has she seen this semester's final exam? Because if Hamilton changes his approach, all of these historical patterns might not apply. Room went quiet for a moment, and I could sense that my persistent questions were starting to irritate everyone, not just Rowan. Why do you keep questioning everything? Milo asked, his usually mild demeanor showing signs of frustration. We have access to incredibly valuable information that could make the difference between medical school acceptance and having to retake organic chemistry. Why are you so determined to make this harder than it needs to be? Because I think we're losing sight of the actual goal, I replied. The point isn't just to pass Hamilton's exam, it's to actually understand organic chemistry well enough to succeed in medical school and beyond. Understanding comes with time, Ivy said dismissively. Right now, we need to focus on getting the grades that will get us into medical school in the first place. Her logic was internally consistent, but it represented a complete departure from the educational philosophy our group had operated under for 2 years. We'd always believed that deep understanding would naturally lead to strong performance, and that shortcuts ultimately undermined both learning and long-term success. Look, Louis, Rowan said, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining something to a person who's being deliberately obtuse. I get that you're uncomfortable with this, but Elara isn't doing anything unethical. She's a graduate student helping undergraduates succeed, which is literally part of her job description. And if you're not comfortable benefiting from her insights, that's your choice. But don't try to sabotage our success because of your moral reservations. The word sabotage hit me like a physical blow. After 2 years of organizing our study sessions, creating materials, and helping everyone understand complex concepts, I was now being characterized as someone who is actively working against my friend's academic success. I'm not trying to sabotage anything, I said quietly. I'm just trying to make sure we don't lose track of why we started studying together in the first place. Things change, Louis, June said, though her tone was gentler than Rowan's. We all appreciate everything you've done for this group. But maybe it's time to recognize that we've found a more efficient approach. More efficient. That phrase encapsulated everything that had gone wrong with our group dynamic. We'd replaced collaborative learning and genuine understanding with efficiency. A system optimized for gaming Hamilton's specific testing methods, rather than actually mastering organic chemistry. As I gathered my materials at the end of that session, I realized that my friends had made their choice. They preferred the promise of easy success through insider information over the uncertain rewards of rigorous preparation, and they'd made it clear that my commitment to the latter approach was now viewed as an obstacle to their goals. What they didn't know was that their efficient strategy was built on a foundation that was about to crumble completely. While they prepared for Hamilton's exam based on historical patterns and second-hand insights, I was scheduled to meet with the professor himself the following morning to discuss my new role as his grading assistant for the final exam. Soon, I would discover just how dramatically Hamilton had changed his approach this semester, and how worthless all of Elara's historical analysis would prove to be. The final break came on the Thursday evening before our final exam, exactly 5 days. Before the test that would determine our organic chemistry grades and potentially our medical school futures, I arrived at study room 314 in Thornton Hall at our usual time, carrying a stack of challenging practice problems. I'd selected from multiple textbooks, the kind of comprehensive review that had always served our group well before major exams. But when I pushed open the door, I found the room empty, confused. I checked my phone for any messages about a location change. Nothing. I waited 15 minutes. Then 20, growing increasingly concerned that something had happened to prevent our usual session. Finally, decided to text the group chat. "Hey everyone, I'm in our usual room but don't see anyone. Did we change locations?" The responses came quickly, but not in the group chat. Instead, I received individual texts that clearly had been coordinated in advance. June. "Sorry, Louis. We decided to have a smaller session tonight, just cramming the specific topics Elara identified as most important. Flora. We didn't want to waste time on broader review when we know exactly what Hamilton's going to test. Milo, thanks for everything you've done for the group. We'll catch up after the exam." I stared at my phone screen, reading and rereading these messages as their full implications sank in. After 2 years of organizing and leading our study group, after countless hours spent helping each of these people understand complex concepts, I was being excluded from our final preparation session, and it wasn't an oversight or a miscommunication. It was a deliberate decision. The worst part was the casualness of it. No group discussion, no explanation of their reasoning, no acknowledgement of what our collaboration had meant over the past 2 years. Just a quiet decision that I was no longer needed, communicated through brief, polite text messages that felt like formal dismissals. I sat alone in the empty study room for another 10 minutes, staring at the whiteboard where I'd drawn thousands of molecular structures over the past 2 years. The familiar space suddenly felt hollow and unwelcoming, transformed from a place of collaborative learning into a monument to my rejection. Finally, I gathered the courage to call Rowan directly. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear background voices that confirmed my suspicions about where the smaller session was taking place. "Hey Lewis, what's up? I got everyone's messages about tonight's session. I guess I'm just confused about why I wasn't included." There was a pause, and I heard him moving to a quieter location. "Look, man, I didn't want it to happen this way. But everyone's been feeling like your approach might not be the best use of our limited study time. My approach, the constant questioning of Elara's insights, the insistence on working through extra problems when we already know what Hamilton's going to test, the ethical concerns about using available resources. Everyone's stressed enough without having to debate study strategies." I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. "Rowan, I've been organizing these sessions for 2 years. I've helped every single person in this group understand concepts they were struggling with. And now you're telling me that my approach is the problem? And we're all grateful for that, Louis. But this is different. This is about being strategic with our final preparation time. Elara has given us a roadmap for success, and frankly, your constant pushback is making everyone doubt themselves when they should be feeling confident. So the solution is to exclude me entirely? The solution is to let everyone focus on what they need to do to succeed on Hamilton's exam. And right now, that means following Elara's guidance without second-guessing every piece of advice." I closed my eyes, trying to process the reality that my closest friends had essentially fired me from the study group I'd created. "You know what, Rowan? I hope Elara's strategy works out for everyone. I really do. Louis, don't take this personally. After the exam, once all this stress is over, things can go back to normal. But we both knew that wasn't true. Some decisions create permanent changes in relationships, and this was one of them. By choosing to exclude me rather than simply disagreeing with my methods, they'd fundamentally altered the nature of our friendship. There would be no going back to normal after this. "Good luck on the exam," I said, and hung up as I walked out of Thornton Hall. I made a decision that would determine the outcome of Hamilton's final exam for all of us. My friends had chosen to rely entirely on insider information and shortcuts rather than genuine preparation. They'd decided that my commitment to thorough understanding was a liability rather than an asset. Tomorrow, when I met with Professor Hamilton to begin my work as his grading assistant, I would discover just how catastrophically wrong their strategy had been. And when the time came to grade their exams, I would ensure that their shortcuts received exactly the recognition they deserved. They wanted to succeed through gaming the system rather than mastering the material. It was time for them to learn. What happened when the system decided to game them back? The next morning, I sat across from Professor Hamilton in his cluttered office on the third floor of Whitmore Chemistry Building, surrounded by towering stacks of research journals and molecular models that caught the early sunlight streaming through his window. The man who struck fear into the hearts of pre-med students across campus looked surprisingly approachable in this setting. His wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what appeared to be my academic transcript. "Louis, your work as a grading assistant for the introductory courses has been exceptional," he began, setting my file aside and folding his hands on his desk. "Professor Chen speaks very highly of your attention to detail and your ability to provide constructive feedback to students. That's exactly what I need for a project I've been developing this semester." "Thank you, Professor Hamilton. I'm honored that you'd consider me for this position. Let me explain what I have in mind," he continued, leaning forward with the kind of intensity that made his lectures so compelling. "For the past 3 years, I've been growing increasingly concerned about the predictability of my exam formats. Too many students have been focusing on gaming my testing patterns rather than developing genuine understanding of organic chemistry principles." I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke, thinking immediately of my former study group and their complete reliance on Elara's historical analysis of his testing methods. So this semester, I've completely redesigned my approach to the final exam. Instead of following the traditional format that students have come to expect, I've created what I call an adaptive assessment. The exam adjusts its focus based on demonstrated student weaknesses, emphasizing deeper conceptual understanding rather than pattern recognition. That sounds like a significant change, I managed, my mind racing as I considered the implications for students who had been preparing based on outdated assumptions about his testing style. "Exactly, and that's where I need your help, Professor." Hamilton pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between us. "I need someone I can trust to help implement the new grading rubric I've developed. It's designed to reward students who demonstrate genuine comprehension of underlying principles, while identifying those who have simply memorized surface-level patterns." He opened the folder, revealing the actual final exam dozens of pages, of problems unlike anything I'd seen in Hamilton's previous tests. Instead of the standard format that Elara had described to my former friends, this exam was structured as a series of interconnected case studies that required students to apply multiple concepts simultaneously. As you can see, this isn't the type of exam that can be gamed through insider knowledge of my historical preferences, Hamilton explained with a slight smile. Students will need to demonstrate real mastery of the material to succeed. I studied the problems, immediately recognizing that they required exactly the kind of deep, elaborative understanding that our original study group had been built around. The synthesis problems weren't simple 3-step sequences. They were complex, multi-pathway challenges that demanded creative problem-solving. The mechanism questions required students to explain their reasoning rather than simply drawing arrow-pushing patterns. The stereochemistry applications were embedded within larger contexts that tested conceptual understanding rather than rote memorization. Professor Hamilton, this is incredibly comprehensive. Students who prepared using traditional methods might find this quite challenging. That's precisely the point, Louis. I want to identify students who have developed genuine expertise versus those who have simply learned to navigate my usual testing format. Medical schools need future doctors who can think critically under pressure, not students who excel at academic gamesmanship. He handed me a detailed grading rubric that was equally revolutionary. Instead of awarding points primarily for correct final answers, the rubric emphasized the reasoning process, conceptual connections, and evidence of deep understanding. Students could earn significant credit for demonstrating solid thinking even if they made minor computational errors, but they would lose points for correct answers that lacked proper justification. Your job will be to help me implement this rubric consistently across all exams. I need someone who understands both the material and the pedagogical goals behind this new approach. I'd be honored to help with this project, Professor Hamilton. Excellent. The exam is scheduled for Monday morning. Over the weekend, I'll need you to familiarize yourself thoroughly with both the questions and the grading criteria. Then, immediately after the exam, we'll begin the evaluation process. As I left Hamilton's office with the folder containing the real exam and grading rubric, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, I was genuinely excited about the pedagogical innovation Hamilton had developed and honored to be trusted with implementing it. On the other hand, I couldn't stop thinking about my former friends and how completely unprepared they would be for this new format. While I'd been learning about Hamilton's revolutionary approach to assessment, they were spending their final preparation days drilling themselves on mechanisms, patterns, and stereochemistry shortcuts that would be largely irrelevant to the actual exam. Elara's historical analysis, which they'd trusted so completely, become worse than useless, it was actively misleading them toward a preparation strategy that would virtually guarantee poor performance. That evening, decided to check our old group chat, curious about how their final preparations were progressing. What I found confirmed my worst fears about the path they'd chosen. Rowan had posted a series of messages outlining their final strategy, based entirely on the outdated intelligence Elara had provided. Okay, everyone, final game plan, 40% mechanisms, focus on arrow-pushing patterns, 30% stereochemistry, memorize the standard examples, 20% synthesis, stick to simple 2 to 3 step sequences, 10% nomenclature, and basics. If we nail these percentages, we're guaranteed top grades. June had responded, "Perfect. I've been drilling mechanism patterns all day. Feeling super confident about Monday." Flora, "Same here. Elara's insights have made this so much more manageable. Going to crush this exam." I stared at my phone screen, watching my former friends celebrate their preparation for an exam that didn't exist. They were spending their final weekend memorizing patterns for a test format that Hamilton had completely abandoned, trusting information that was not only outdated but actively counterproductive. The ethical implications of my situation weren't lost on me. I possessed information that could help them adjust their preparation strategy and potentially avoid academic disaster. A single anonymous tip about Hamilton's new format could give them a fighting chance to adapt their approach in the remaining days, but they had made their choice when they excluded me from their final preparation session. They had decided that insider information and shortcuts were more valuable than the collaborative learning and genuine understanding I'd tried to maintain. They had chosen to trust Elara's secondhand analysis over the thorough preparation methods that had served our group well for 2 years. Now, as I sat in my apartment reviewing Hamilton's actual exam and grading rubric, I realized that their strategy wasn't just flawed, it was a perfect recipe for failure. Students who approached this exam expecting to game traditional patterns would find themselves completely lost when confronted with complex, interconnected problems that required genuine mastery of organic chemistry principles. My former friends had gambled their academic futures on insider information that turned out to be worthless. They had excluded the one person who could have helped them recognize the flaws in their strategy. And now, as Hamilton's grading assistant, I was positioned to ensure that their shortcuts received exactly the evaluation they deserved. The irony was almost poetic. While they celebrated having access to privileged information through Elara, I had quietly gained access to something far more valuable, the power to determine how their actual performance would be evaluated and graded. They thought they had found the perfect shortcut to academic success. On Monday morning, they would discover that the only shortcut they'd found was a direct path to failure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.